We haven't talked about climate change in a while, hope you didn't forget about that. Recently, Ben Shapiro has returned to the college campus and he is putting some dumb college students in their place. There are a few other segments I do want to go into. For example, there was a discussion regarding transgenderism and biology, but for today we'll just talk about this one regarding climate change. Maybe for the upcoming weeks we'll touch on the other topics for a bit. Upvote this video if that's what you want to see.
Hi Ben, my name's Ember. In 2021, you said that the potential rise of global temperatures by 4 degrees Celsius due to climate change is, quote, not an emergency, and even made fun of top scientists for calling climate change a climate emergency. A new study by the Journal of Natural Science says that if by the end of the century, climate change will total up to 83 million deaths because of climate-related causes.
Yeah, they're wrong. Sorry, go ahead, but continue, but I'll explain why. Go ahead.
I'm wondering, Ben, why you believe that climate change is not an emergency.
Okay, because they're wrong.
Okay, so the paper that is being referred to here was published during the summer of 2021, titled The Morality Cost of Carbon. We have a lot of estimates when it comes to carbon emissions and how it impacts our future, and this paper uses a new model to estimate how many lives will be lost, and in turn also gives us a rough number on how much CO2 equates to a single death. Let's take a look at the abstract. Many studies project that climate change can cause a significant number of excess deaths. Yet, in integrated assessment models that determine the social cost of carbon and prescribe optimal climate policy, human mortality impacts are limited and not updated to the latest scientific understanding. This study extends the DICE 2016 IAM to explicitly include temperature-related mortality impacts by estimating a climate mortality damage function. We introduce a metric, the mortality cost of carbon, that estimates the number of deaths caused by emissions of 1 additional metric ton of CO2. In the baseline emission scenario, the 2020 MCC is 2.26 times 10 to the negative 4 excess deaths per metric ton of 2020 emissions. This implies that adding 4,434 metric tons of carbon dioxide in 2020, equivalent to the lifetime emissions of 3.5 average Americans, causes 1 excess death globally in expectation between 2020 to 2100. Incorporating mortality costs increases the 2020 SEC from $37 to $256 per metric ton in the baseline emission scenario. Optimal climate policy changes from gradual emissions reduction starting in 2050 to full decarbonization by 2050 when mortality is considered. Okay, so for the sake of keeping this video simplistic, let's not go into the algorithms used to create this model. As we saw in the video, Ben Shapiro said these scientists are just wrong, plain wrong. I wonder what his argument for that could be.
So now here's the, sorry, I didn't let you get to the question mark. The reason that they are wrong is because all of these studies are done in the absence of mitigating measures. So as I've said before, when I talk about climate change, when you're talking about climate change, there are a couple of things human beings can do. And by the way, I accept IPCC estimates. They range from sort of the mild, like 1.5 degrees Celsius, all the way up to the not very mild, like 4 degrees Celsius, again, over the course of the century. And because there is this range, the more extreme versions of this, the 4 degrees Celsius, whenever you read the IPCC reports, which I have, when you read those reports, they say in them that they have very low confidence that some of the more catastrophic sort of predictions are going to occur. They will say low to moderate confidence. The less catastrophic predictions, they'll say more like high confidence or fair high confidence, that kind of stuff.
So in case you didn't get the idea of his argument, he's saying that these scientific studies are based on the most catastrophic outcome as predicted with no mitigation efforts whatsoever, where everyone pollutes as much as they want, or in other words, the worst case scenario as predicted with up to 4 degrees Celsius of temperature change. I don't know what kind of papers he's read to lead him to believe that all scientific climate predictions are the same, but from what I've read, real scientific papers at least, they usually acknowledge that kind of scenario they're trying to predict. And this paper is no exception. The model is based on current trends, which leads to at least a 2-degree increase towards 2050, which is actually what seems to be the consensus on where we are headed right now, in up to 4 degrees in 2100. According to the article, in total, we find that there are 83 million projected cumulative deaths between 2020 and 2100 in the central estimate in the DICE baseline emission scenario. By the end of the century, the projected 4.6 million excess yearly deaths would put climate change 6th on the 2017 global burden of disease risk factor risk list ahead of outdoor air pollution and just below obesity. We have shown that in the DICE baseline emission scenario that results in 4.1 degree warming by 2100, the central estimate MCC is significant. Now you're probably thinking, but stick, that's 4.1 degrees of warming, which is the extreme end that Ben Shapiro was talking about. But no, the estimates that he is referring to are over the next few decades, closer to 2050. 4.1 degrees is by 2100, many decades later, so 4.1 is not an extreme scenario. And of course, you can always say that this can be improved since we don't know what the future is like and perhaps we'll have some sort of technological breakthrough, but you can't say this isn't an estimate based on a very, very likely scenario. Of course, I don't expect Ben Shapiro to have read this paper at all. Maybe he reads scientific papers, maybe he doesn't, but we can't expect him to have seen every one that has been published out there. So he just made a bullshit claim that that scientific paper must have used the most extreme scenario, which as we've seen here absolutely does not. So that's his first claim debunked.
Okay, here is the thing. When people suggest that there is not going to be any sort of mitigation measures, this is wrong, or adaptation. So there's two ways you can deal with it. One is mitigation, which is we all stop driving cars, we stop using electricity, we don't have kids anymore, right? We really cut down on our carbon usage in ways that are catastrophic to the world economy. And what it really mostly does is it says to people in the developing world, hey, you're screwed. Because those are the people who really need carbon-based emissions. It's very easy for those of us who live in extraordinarily prosperous societies to say, you know what, I'm cutting down my carbon emissions a little bit because we live in very prosperous societies.
While yes, developing countries are very heavily dependent on carbon-based energies, they also emit a lot less than developed countries do. And they are the first to feel the effects of climate change. Don't pretend that the burden is equally shared between developed and developing countries. It's not. Our CO2 output is magnitudes higher than any developing country, and we have the money plus technology to do something about it, and yet we choose not to, partly because half the population here doesn't believe in climate change, and those people write our laws and determine our scientific funding.
In order for us to take the mitigation measures that would be necessary in order to dramatically lower the trajectory of global climate change, you'd have to get China to sign on, which they will not. You'd have to get India to sign on, which they will not. Those are the two largest carbon-based emitters on planet Earth, and we live in a geopolitical world in which a carbon emission from China counts the same as a carbon emission from the United States.
Ah, the classic pointing your finger at others. They're not doing anything, why should we? First of all, these two countries have significantly higher populations than the United States, and if we compare the output per capita, the US is leading by a long mile. Second of all, China is literally the leader of renewable energy and technology. Why does nobody talk about this and think that China is doing nothing? They're doing a hell of a lot more than the United States is doing, trying to cover a population many times higher than that of the US while having a huge portion of their country still in developing mode. At the very least, they're doing significant work and investing in a transition. And for the sake of argument, let's just say that China is doing nothing, which absolutely isn't true. Even if we give you that, why not be the first to set an example? We shouldn't even be looking at other countries at all. We should be focusing on what we ourselves can do.
Which says, again, this doesn't mean there's nothing we can do. It means what we ought to be doing is the thing that will prevent the 83 million deaths, which is why I'm very confident it will prevent the 83 million deaths, adaptation. This means, for example, that we build seawalls. The simple fact of the matter is that New Orleans exists below sea level. When the seawalls, when levees were breached because the levees were poorly built, it killed 10,000 people.
What I suggested, Ben, is instead of pretending like you know what the paper is talking about, just openly admit you haven't read the paper and you'll get to it. No one is going to criticize you for not reading 1 out of a million scientific papers in preparation for a Q&A. That would be miles better than you sitting there pretending you know what the paper is talking about and then attempting to debunk it. When the paper estimated this mortality number, it was doing so primarily by looking at excess deaths caused by temperature-related complications such as heat stroke and not from indirect causes such as flooding or sea level rise, which leads to a lot of other complications. So since infrastructure destruction caused by sea level rise was not a consideration, it doesn't factor into the 83 million. But this also tells us that the number is possibly much higher and also doesn't include things like displacements, lower quality of life, etc. Of course, no one is saying this model is perfect. It's just a prediction, just like the many other predictions we have out there. But it's still a valuable tool, and for this model to have any value, you at least have to interpret it correctly, wouldn't you say, Ben?
When the levees, last time around, this last year, there was a major hurricane. It swept directly through the exact same area, and pretty much no one was killed. The reason being, the levees were much better built. When you're looking at coastal, low-lying areas, seawalls have been built in places in Miami, in places in Seattle.
Since developing countries are going to be the first hit by climate change, what, are we going to build these for them? They can't particularly afford to build these preventative measures themselves. You talk about places like Seattle or other cities in the US as if that's the only part of the world that matters, but what happens to developing countries that can't afford to protect themselves? Climate change is going to result in a lot of damages, from heat strokes to more natural disasters to greater disease spreading to loss of agriculture. How exactly do we build something for everything, for everyone, in every part of the world? That seems to be a lot more ambitious than just simply reducing carbon emissions and transitioning to renewable energy.
Geoengineering, which is a methodology that's being explored largely in some of the northern European countries for actually changing the climate itself by, for example, shooting particular types of material into the air. These sorts of solutions are things we should be pursuing.
We are already using aerosols to slow down climate change, but that's only a temporary solution. It's not even the best temporary solution out there. We cannot rely on something like that to fix our climate because it comes with other consequences. If you want to stop a bathtub from filling up, the temporary solution of turning the faucet down is only temporary. Aerosols will only buy us time. It's not the solution itself.
They're a lot easier to do because technology is a lot easier to do than anything remotely approaching a global carbon tax, which will, number one, be unsuccessful, and two, will not mitigate the effects on the climate nearly as much as you're talking about.
Yes, we do have a lot of technological advancements, and these are getting cheaper and cheaper as we speak. But technology itself will never be the answer. We need to use it in combination with other measures in order to solve this global issue of climate change. from reducing CO2 emissions to investing more in renewable energy, which by the way is part of technology, I guess. But Ben thinks that these will just magically happen without intervention. But as we've seen again and again, it doesn't seem like many people, especially large corporations and political figures, have much interest in this. That's not to say we're not developing technologies, but that we can and should be doing a lot more. The more we invest now to prevent climate change, the less we will have to pay later. Anyway, that's the end of the video. I likely will be taking a break next week, so there won't be a video, but I will be back the week after. Bye bye.